video. My 10-year-old is still very confused why Daddy needs his iPad. He's very jealous. All right, so let's do some housekeeping. And so reminder that I really don't have anything to do with in terms of the textbooks distributing. The department handles all that, and they communicate it with the printers, and they communicate with the bookstores. So bookstore calls me, and I'm like, dude, I got nothing to do with it. So Mr. Chris is aware, they put in an order. So what I'm going to do is what I can do: accommodate. So usually I have the chalkboard where I'm writing and drawing very horrible pictures usually. But what I'm going to do is until we get to, and actually it helps us because the first couple classes is kind of review about muscles and function before we get into specific muscles and function of biomechanics. So in other words, your 310 old text is going to serve here. But if we do move on before those are available, I'm just going to put the slides up on the overhead. I'll find a way to not use the chalkboard, but I'll put the slides on overhead, and dude, feel free to send a picture of it for your reference, in other words, I'm going to get it to you how I'm going to get it to you, okay? So we'll adapt, we'll improvise, and make sure you get all the stuff. Also, I'm doing this for the first time. So I'm going to be posting these. I know you guys probably went back and rewatched the syllabus lecture. That's good stuff, right? However, when we get into material, having that to go back over and review, right? So don't stress about it, man. We'll make it work. That being said, remember the first part of biomechanics in this class is specific mechanics and function of specific muscles. Guys, muscle function, in terms of individual muscle function, has everything involved in biomechanics. What I mean by that is in biomechanics labs, like the kind I came from Auburn, you can do electromyographical studies, EMG studies, that's the muscles. And then there's motion capture stuff, movement, right? Movement stuff, because guess what's moving you? The muscles. And then we have force plates, which are very expensive, very fancy scales. But again, who's creating the forces? The muscles. So muscles have it all. They have levers, and there's pulleys, and there's Newton, and there's everything involved in muscles. So although muscle function, what do muscles do in terms of their directions of pull? I'm going to be slipping in biomechanical terms, biomechanical processes, biomechanical concepts as we go through all these muscles. And that way, in my opinion, once we get to the specific concepts in general, classes of leverage, and it's good. Oh yeah, like that muscle. Oh yeah, I see how that does. Oh yeah, okay. Let's find it works better that way. However, before we get into specific muscles, let's recite the code of the L's, shall we? Treat no? Okay. No elephants, I think. Let's remind ourselves what muscles do. Muscles can only, that's it. They can only pull. We can push, but that's because there's stuff inside our skin that's pulling. And that may be hard to accept. Mechanically, well, my muscles aren't pushing. My hand is pushing. But the muscles are pulling. It's almost a play off of we rotate to translate. The reason segments can push on things is because we have muscles that are pulling on things. Now, bones can push. Bones can push. The bones in my hands are pushing, and the bones in my elbow. But guess what? Muscles are pulling on those. So an example of a bone pushing is like when you do a squat. Your muscles, your quad muscle, right? Pulling at the top of your patella, but you have that tendon also pulling at the bottom. Those muscles are pulling on the bone, and then that bone indirectly pushes on other bones. Bones can push, but muscles can pull. Another example is when you're doing push-ups, right? Your muscles are pulling on bone, but that olecranon on that ulna is pushing on the humerus. Bones can push. muscles are pulling on the bones in order. That kind of makes sense? Okay. One more example. If you think about drawing a bow back and letting it go to shoot an arrow, right? That string is obviously pulling, but technically the part that the nock is on is pushing the arrow forward. So it's an indirect push. So when we think about pushing things with our feet or with our hands, we just have to make sure we remember that that push is because of a pull. The push is because of a pull. In 3:10, I said this several times, that if muscles could do both, if muscles could push and pull, we would only need half of the muscles in our body. In other words, we wouldn't need, if muscles could push and pull, we wouldn't need the ones on the back or the ones on the outside, right? Because they can only pull, that means we have to cover all of our bases. Someone who's working a puppet and they're moving the puppet, and they need strings in every direction of motion that they want the puppet to move in. Okay? A reminder about how muscles work. This is macromechanics, not micromechanics. Micromechanics is when Dr. Davis and Dr. Sato get into acting and medicine. I had that for my master's degree, and I was like, I'm out. This is a lot of wizardry stuff, man. I like to be able to see things, and I just don't understand it. So this is macromechanics. What I mean by that is, it doesn't matter all the different enzymes and calcium and ryanodine receptors. This is the so what. Muscles have excitability. They have elasticity. They have irritability. They have contractility. All that means is that if I zap it with electricity, it's going to pull more. Because of the contractile stuff, right? The stuff that gets innervated. If I put more electricity into it, it's going to pull more because of the little actin mines. You guys have ever played with the stim machines, right? You put the stim machines on and you crank up the juice. What happens? The more juice you give it, the more it pulls. Did I tell you the story about in Mexico when I did the electricity thing? You heard that story? Big tall yo, man. One of my good friends from Mexico, she was an exchange student, and I went to visit her, and her boyfriend was very jealous. I was like, dude, I'm from Delta, I have nothing to worry about. But the first night, now we got cool, but the first night, he motioned this dude, this guy was clinking these little metal things, I don't know what the heck that was, so he motions him over, and I thought it was gonna smoke it, I didn't know what it was. And he said, test of manhood. And I'm like, oh my God. And basically the game was you held on to these two electrodes, and the little dude, you gave him 10 pesos to play, and he just juiced you up until you gave up. And I was contorted. I mean, I was like, tongue. But the more he turned it, the more my muscles went in the tendons. So it's a very simple concept. You don't really have to know all the intrinsics, the T-tubules. I'm not saying you don't need to know for some things that you may do, but I'm saying in terms of just the so what. You give it electricity, and the more electricity you give it, the more it pulls. Now, we don't have external electrodes, but we have internal electrodes with our nerves. And that's actually why, this is really cool. That's why the stim machines don't correlate to they do correlate to hypertrophy. However, you're not also hypertrophying your nerve channel. So the point is that it's going to decondition right away because you haven't worked the signal inside your body to deliver that message to the muscle. So that's why the external things. Now, keep in mind, what I'm not saying is this, electrical stuff, or I should say that's not what I'm saying, because if you notice all my athletic trainers and people that work in the therapy, when you put on the stim, what do you tell them? Consciously fire that muscle, right? But if you never work your electrodes, then you can't adapt your electrode. So when we used to do those stims, we always told them, now you consciously try to fire with it. It's like trying to learn to ride a bike, and you have that parent there trying to guide you, right? But the kid is still trying to balance until they get it on their own. Okay? So In 310, I'm just reminding you about if muscles can only pull, a logical next question is, well, what's pulling? What are the components of the pull? The first one I talked about, the contractile components, the actin, the myosin, the stuff that responds to electricity, the stuff that's excitable. Now, the cool thing about the excitable stuff is that in order to kind of get everybody on the same page, you kind of have to line everybody up. And there's pros and cons of it. But skeletal muscles, they're all lined up, right? Back in the myosin. And there's that limb tension curve you may or may not be familiar with. But that's because everybody's lined up. Smooth muscle's different. Smooth muscle, all the actin and myosin is random. And the reason it's random is so that way, at different lengths, you have the same tone, you have the same pull. In the contractile components, as you shorten, it pulls less. And as you lengthen, it pulls less because of being pulled away, overlap, right? In skeletal muscle, it's like, in heart muscle, it's like skeletal muscle, except for the neural part of it. Meaning that you can't consciously save fire. It does it automatically. So that's the difference between that and that. The probably more important, I'd say more important, less talked about, I'm not going to say more important, I'm going to say less discussed, is the component of a muscle's pull that's inert. The component of a muscle's pull that doesn't respond to electricity. And that's the stretchy stuff, the elastic components of the muscle. You go to a rubber band and you zap it with electricity, it's not going to do anything, because it's inert. We have rubber band-like properties in our muscle. Our tendons don't respond to electricity. You zap it, and it's like when I tell my cat anything, it's just like, do whatever. Muscles, belly, right? The contractile components, it's like a dog. You can teach a dog to respond, right? Sit, behave, show. The stretchy stuff is like a cat. You tell a cat to do something, that cat isn't doing nothing. The cat does what it wants. This is the important concept of the stretchy stuff. Although they don't respond to innervation, although they don't respond to electricity, they do respond to length changes. Longer will always be stronger until it snaps apart. It's a component of elasticity. For those of you that have ever played with TheraBands, you know darn well the more you lengthen it, the more it wants to return to its original shape. Longer is stronger, not with the contractile components, but with the elastic components, the rubber band-like properties. And the cool thing is that when you look at this graph, this length tension graph, it's at the end, get away! Let's see where it is. Oh, I know where it is. Sawe, Janae. I think it's here. Maybe it was in 310. Don't forget, guys, no class Monday. There we go. This is really cool. So, has anybody been shown this in 303 or any other classes, length tension curves of sarcomeres and muscles? Anybody? It's all good? Okay, so what this means, there's a term that's thrown around that I'm not saying it's wrong, we just have to make sure we're on the same page of what it means, and that's resting length. That's a very catch-all term, not like shin splints. There could be a lot of different things wrong when you say shin splints, just my shins hurt. Resting length means, let's think of it from this perspective. Actin and myosin, in terms of their articulation, you want to be in a position where if you need to contract with as much force as possible, you want to be ready to go in a position that you are in a majority of the time. Meaning, resting length isn't halfway through a motion. Resting length is the length that your muscles are in the majority of the time. Not true anatomical, but like functional anatomical. I'll give you an example. If you're in a sling for a very long time, which we don't like to do, right, because of muscle atrophy and you get muscle wasted. Back in the day, they didn't know about that. They didn't know that unless you have to, there's some cases where you have to cast it, but now we don't like to do that. But imagine if you were in a sling for a few weeks. When you got out of that sling, do you think your arm's going to do this? Of course not. It's going to be stiff. When you get out of bed, if you've been sleeping in a fetal position, your muscles are stiff. Because when you shorten muscles, shorter than resting length, your body says, oh, well, this must be the position they want me to be ready to fire and have maximum force. So your body will readjust its actin and myosin to be optimal at what they think is your new resting length. So resting length, that blue line, isn't halfway through a motion. Because it's easy to say, well, resting length is going to be halfway here. Well, how do you account for cervical stuff? What's halfway? Halfway here? Halfway there? Am I read longer? Shorter? No. Resting length is the position that it's in the majority of the time. People can have different resting lengths. If I walk around like this, my front muscles are going to establish a new resting length. Notice what happens. Well, first of all, let me identify some things on this curve, on this trend. The red line is the innervative stuff, the stuff that responds to electricity. The active components, the contractile components, actin myosin. At resting length, the length of your muscle is the majority of the time, you have optimal actin myosin direction. In other words, they are ready to go when they're needed, because that's the position you're in the majority of the time. When you shorten, you overlap those actin myosin, and now all of a sudden you don't have optimal interaction. You still have some interaction, but you don't have optimal. Now, you may say, well, why would you need that? Well, sometimes it should make sense. When you talk about injury or speeding up, slowing down, when you shorten something, typically the job is done. It's time to think about slowing it down. So actually, when you start to shorten shorten more than resting length, usually it's associated with not needing to use more force. It's kind of start to slow down motion. But here's the other cool thing. You can't have one without the other. Pros, cons, yin, yang. If the concept of overlap causes less muscle pull because of the actin, then increasing the length beyond resting length is also going to cause a decrease. You can't have one without the other. Now, lengthening with less pull from the actin and myosin, they also sound like, well, why is that not a good thing? Well, two reasons. If I lengthen something, unlike shortening something, a rubber band has never snapped by being short. A rubber band is always snapped by being too long. So if your muscles lengthen well beyond resting length, and your only option is to innervate more, there may be a problem. So what happens is that someone comes to the rescue. Someone comes to the rescue. When you go longer than resting length, when you stretch something longer, yes, the actin and myosin go down in terms of their contribution, but we kind of want that. But someone comes to the rescue, and that's the elastic stuff. The rubber band-like properties. The elasticity of the inner stretchy components. Tendons, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, all that stretchy stuff. It's all the same stuff. Where it is why it's called something different. What's the difference between interstitial fluid and blood plasma?
location, location, location. It's the same stuff. But where it's located gives it a different name. It's the same thing here. Your tendon actually passes through the muscle, but we just call it different stuff because of its location. So when you go longer than resting, the stretchy stuff shoots up to help the contractile stuff slow you down. If you think about it, we don't need help when we go shorter. We need help when we go longer. That make sense? Okay. So notice the contractile components shoot down when we go past resting, but look how the stretchy stuff shoots up, and it keeps the total tension up, and it actually keeps going up if you go super far out. That's all stretchy stuff. And that's actually where this is kind of cool. That's where your damage is. When you look at soreness, right, the late onset muscle soreness, your damage is in the stretchy stuff. You don't see broken myosin heads when they do biopsies and they're looking inside. They don't see broken myosin heads. They see what they call Z-line streaming. They see damage to the inner stretchy materials. Thank you, stretchy components, for all that you do for us. All right, so muscles can only pull. If muscles can only pull, that means that without an injury, oh my gosh, he was so small back then. That little kid right there is 13 years old now. Yo, man, scary. Okay. Or review. Muscles can only pull. How do they pull? Well, a combination of contractile stuff that can be innervated and stretchy stuff that it depends on its length. Okay? What happens when it pulls? So, this is the whole blood pressure analogy that I gave you in 310. What is atmospheric pressure? 760. Right? 760 millimeters of mercury. Your venous pressure is like 40. So if things go from higher pressure to low pressure, if I break my finger, I should implode, right? And you're like, oh, that's silly a little bit. But you know it doesn't. Well, why? Well, because this 40 is on top of 760. In other words, 760 is everywhere. So when we say 40, what we're really saying is 800. But because 760 is everywhere, we subtract it and we just record the difference. We give the extra, we give the lanyard. 120 over 80 technically is 120 over 80 plus 760 on both is what I'm trying to get to. And that's the same thing for contraction. Muscles are always pull. Muscles pull when you die. Rigor mortis, right? Muscles are always pull. But we don't say they're always contracted. Now you get into semantics. So what does contraction mean? Contraction means being innervated above rest. Resting tone. That's like atmospheric pressure. Resting tone is the amount of pull your muscles are giving at rest. In other words, you can sustain it. You don't get tired at rest. You can watch all 8 episodes of The Witcher and not get tired. So it's that baseline. Resting tone is baseline, but you're not working. Here's another example. Someone who's a bricklayer, their muscles are working when they're at home resting. But when they lay in bricks, they're doing a job, their muscles are working more, obviously. You have to condition yourself to do that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to, again, remind you about the clarification between work. What does work mean? Work, in essence, means to do a job. To do a job. When you work, you do a job. This is my job. I'm doing work. Metaphorically. Muscles are the same thing. Why do muscles work to do a job? And any job that you call your muscle to do is above rest. Is above a resting tone, above what they're pulling at rest. Does that make sense? Do you remember that? Okay. So, the next question. Well, if muscles can do work, if muscles can do jobs, what kind of jobs can they do? What kind of work can they do? Remember from 310, contraction is a tough word for me. Because contraction seems to imply shortening, right? If you contract a business, you can contract it. Contraction doesn't mean to shorten, because we know we have eccentric contraction, and that's being lengthened, and we have isometric contraction, that's not lengthened. So what contraction really means is trying to shorten. And that's what it's doing. Muscles can only pull, that means you're trying to shorten. You're trying to get the two ends close together. So I use contraction and work interchangeably. When you're contracting a muscle above rest, you're doing it for a reason. And listen, sometimes that reason could be like nature's splint. Like if you have an injury, you may spasm a muscle, isometrically contract above rest, just to prevent you from having motion that your body doesn't want to do. That's a job. Isometrics can be jobs, even though you don't think about it. Spasms, they're doing a job. You may not like it, and it may hurt, but your body doesn't know any different. They're just trying to help you. It's like, look, we don't want this to move right now. Okay? It all comes down to doing a job. So what kind of jobs can muscles do when they get the call? And the call is a metaphor, but the call is literally the nerve sends more signal than at rest and says, do something. We need you. We need you here. And the three types of jobs that muscles can do, they can shorten while trying to shorten above resting tone. They can be lengthened while trying to shorten above resting tone. And they can have no change in length while trying to shorten above resting tone. When the elevator doesn't move, and you're getting off or you're getting on, it's still doing a very important job keeping you from falling to your death. No motion can still be very important. Your cervical extensors are doing a job preventing you from falling over. Some of you have unique techniques, that's all good. But the point is that no motion can still be doing a job. Keeping your hands in certain positions is a job above rest. Whether it's a little bit of weight or a lot of weight, it's still doing a job. So concentric, eccentric, and isometrics are the three types of jobs that muscles can do when you call them to do something. Okay? Pretty straightforward. So far. Good review. Bless you, bless you, bless you, bless you. Now, so what? They can do a job. How do we know when they're doing a job? How do we know when they're working? So for 310, we kept it very simple, and we're going to keep keeping it very simple. You know the person that you're going to call to do a job because of why you need that person to do that job. In other words, if I'm having plumbing issues, I'm going to call a plumber. And if I have electrical issues, I'm going to call an electrician. In 310, I taught you guys for a majority of human movement, you have a tug of war between internal joint influences, your muscles, and external joint influences, gravity and cables and pulleys and walls in the ground, internal versus external. So in terms of seeing who's working, the easiest thing is to understand why they need to be working. Right? Why? That's the whole external forces trying to do this to you, so I need to call these muscles to enhance it, right? So let me give an example. That natural. Okay, so the way we solve, remember there's clues, man, we just got to read the clues. The way we solve who we need to call is by understanding why we need to call. In this exercise, the one to the top right, the weight is trying to extend his elbows. So unless he wants to potentially risk hurting his elbows, we probably don't need muscles that pull in that same direction. That makes sense? We need muscles that pull in the opposite direction. So if the weight is trying to extend his elbows, then we need to call upon some flexors. Now, let's see if you guys remember. Why don't I just say we need to call upon some biceps? There's other muscles, yeah, absolutely. Brachialis, brachioradialis, you got the tertiary muscles, pronator teres in there. But the point is that it's not just the biceps. But if we only always say bicep, then we get into a bad temptation of the analogy I gave in 310 is the movie Coco. You remember the movie Coco? What a great movie. And they say you died 2 deaths. One when you physically die, and the second death is when no one remembers you. You're gone from history. So if all we ever do is talk about the bicep, then those other muscles who are helping do this job don't get talked about, and they vanish off into history. So how do we remedy that? Because we don't have time to do like we're working your body. Hey, do you mind if I get in a set of, I'm going to need to work my biceps, my brachialis, my brachialis, right? That kind of becomes the deal. You got to list all the muscles. So what do we say? We say, I'm going to work my flexors. The muscles that pull in the direction of flexion. That could be 2, that could be 4, that could be 7, that could be 10, it doesn't matter. It's whoever's on that team. Why is the elevator called an elevator? Not because it brings you up, because it also brings you down. It's called an elevator because the cable always pulls up. And it pulls up to bring you up, but guess what? It also pulls up to lower you down. Once again, I can't stress this enough. What we can't say is that the biceps function is flexion. We can't do it. Because if he's just holding this position, right, for this picture, is he flexing? So how do you remedy that? Biceps, flexion. He ain't flexing. And then it gets really freaky if all of a sudden he starts doing this. Right? Whoa! The function of the biceps is flexion, but there's extension. So again, it's just perspective. A lot of the people that write these textbooks, it's not that they're not smart, they're very smart, but maybe they don't come from a biomechanics background to say, well, what could we use to take care of all 3 possibilities? What term could we use so that the motion or lack of motion doesn't matter? The function of the biceps brachii isn't necessarily flexion. That's only a third. Its function is that it pulls in the direction of flexion. That's its function. It's pull. Its direction of pull, not its motion. It's the pull of motion. It's trying to do. And I know that may be like semantical nitpick, but it's extremely important to truly understand how muscles work. Because that biceps brachii can sure be involved in extension. Right? When it's working eccentric. And that biceps brachii can sure be involved in no motion at all when it's working isometric. But in all 3 cases, flexing while trying to flex, no motion while trying to flex, extension while trying to, you get the point. That's consistency, okay? So in 310, we said, hey, I have a group of muscles that pull in every direction of motion, and we're going to talk about them in their group names. If they pull in the direction of motion of hip flexion, we're going to call them the hip flexors. Not that they're causing hip flexion, but that they pull that way. And we have hip abductors. Not that they always going to cause abduction, but they pull that way. We have external rotators. So in other words, think of external rotators, not rotation, but a group of muscles. Ers is plural. When I say flexors, that's plural. That means several muscles that pull a certain way. When I say left lateral cervical benders, that's plural. It's a group of muscles that pull that way. It's not meant to infer motion. It's meant to infer directional pull. An elevator can never move, but it's still pulling up. Cool? All right. So I taught you a technique to first identify who's working because you understand why they're working. And a majority of human movement, external forces and internal forces are going to be going opposite direction. There are rare occasions where external forces and internal forces go in the same direction. And that's when you're trying to move fast, right? When you have the analogy in 310, if you have a tug of war and you have two teams pulling on one rope with no one pulling on the other side, I think that rope's going to fly pretty fast. It's very rare, but sometimes you got to get that mosquito. Another analogy I gave in 310 is think about someone who sprints professionally. I use Usain Bolt for example. That dude does this for a living, but I bet you he spends 0.00001% of his overall day going as fast as he can. So, can external forces and internal forces pull in the same direction? Absolutely. But there's functional reasons to do it, and it's very rare. Doing as many jumping jacks as you can. Right? Or trying to hammering in the nail. Very specific tasks. Nope. Flexors. Nope. Use muscles in the same direction as the external force. So, if you think about it, we have gotten to this part of the road where in 310 it was identifying, hey, I need my elbow flexors in this exercise, or I need my hip extensors in this functional task to slow down my hip flexion to eccentric work. The only thing I'm doing now is saying, once we've identified those groups, knowing that it's plural, right? The hip extensors is a plural, there's several muscles that pull in the direction of hip extension. All we're going to do now is identify who's in that group. Who are the individuals that make up the plurality? Who are the members of the team? So now it's no longer the New Orleans Pelicans as a team. Now it's going to be specific members of the team. Which, by the way, Brandon Ingram. But think about this. Again, analogies. There's certain members of the team that might be more important, might have multiple functions, right? I mean, there's different. Michael Jordan was an important person of the team. That's what we call prime movers. That's a term that's, in other words, very important members of the group. The bicep gets mentioned in curls and stuff, but it's not even the most important muscle in that group. The one under it is the most important muscle in the group. But why doesn't the brachialis get more shine? Because it's hidden. You don't see it. So there's a reason they call them superficial muscles, because they're out for everybody to see, so they get the love. Make sense? Okay. So all we're going to start doing on Wednesday is piggybacking on these concepts and saying, I have left lateral cervical benders, plural. Who are they? Why are they? I have extensors, I have flexors. Now, your body is unbelievably resourceful, efficient. The hardest part of this class, that's the hardest part. A challenging part of this class is to understand that some muscles, based on where they're at, can pull you forward and pull you to the side. Technically, they're trying to do this. But when they work with somebody on that side, they cancel out and do this. When they work with someone on the back, they cancel out and do that. So it's going to be to teach you the orientation of certain muscles, that you can have an anterolateral crossing, and some of its pull is this way, and some of its pull is that way. If you turned off all your muscles and just zapped it, it would do this in the middle. So usually, the Pelicans, the players on the Pelicans are the players on the Pelicans. They can't go play for other teams, is what I'm trying to get to. But in the body, it's a little different. You can have a muscle that's on a front pulling team and also on a lateral pulling team. You can have a muscle that's trying to pull your neck forward to the right and try to spin you to the left. And sometimes it's working with another muscle in one dimension. Sometimes that's an antagonist in that dimension. It's got to work with another muscle. It's like group projects. Where imagine if you had 3 separate projects in a class, and in one of the projects y'all are partners, and another project y'all are partners. That's kind of how this works. That depending on the plane of pull, you may be working with a certain muscle, but in another plane of pull, you may be working with another muscle. And in another plane of pull, you may be working with a different muscle. That's where things get super fun. Okay? So, this weekend, when you guys are having a good time, and maybe you're at a party and the party's kind of dragging, you'd be like, hey man, let's talk about muscle function. Let's do it. And you could pull up some pictures and be like, hey, A plus B is equal to C, man, let's do it. All right, guys, have a good weekend.